Part 2, Chapter 13 of English Prose Style. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. English Prose Style by Herbert Reed. Eloquence. The art of exposition is a mere logic of thought, but when this art is heightened in any way, we must seek another term. The first of these is eloquence, which is the art of exposition animated by the greatness of its theme. Eloquence is either of words or ideas, but the eloquence that is merely of words, lacking force, would be better designated elegance or wit, and is that little frothy water on some gaudy day of Bolingbroke's admirable definition. Quote, eloquence that leads mankind by the ears gives a nobler superiority than power that every dunce may use, or fraud that every knave may employ to lead them by the nose. But eloquence must flow like a stream that is fed by an abundant spring, and not sprout forth like a little frothy water on some gaudy day, and remain dry the rest of the year. End quote. Bolingbroke, Spirit of Patriotism. Sterne makes the same distinction, with rather more elaboration, but significantly, both Sterne and Bolingbroke use the word gaudy. Quote, there are two sorts of eloquence. The one indeed scarce deserves the name of it, which consists chiefly in labored and polished periods, an over-curious and artificial arrangement of figures, tinselled over with a gaudy embellishment of words, which glitter, but convey little or no light to the understanding. This kind of writing is, for the most part, much affected and admired by the people of weak judgment and vicious taste, but is a piece of affectation and formality the sacred writers are utter strangers to. It is a vain and boyish eloquence, and as it has always been esteemed below the great geniuses of all ages, so much more so with respect to those writers who were actuated by the spirit of infinite wisdom, and therefore wrote with that force and majesty with which never man writ. The other sort of eloquence is quite the reverse of this, and which may be said to be the true characteristic of the Holy Scriptures, where the eloquence does not arise from a labored and far-fetched elocution, but from a surprising mixture of simplicity and majesty, which is a double character so difficult to be united that it is seldom to be met with in compositions merely human. End quote. Lawrence Sterne, 42nd Sermon. Elegance is a play with words. Wit a play on words. Elegance, which is concerned with the position of words, disposes them in various figures, and among these we may distinguish antitheses, apostrophe, and hypology. Wit is concerned with the meaning of words, which it deflects or deforms, as in irony, allusion, parody, paronomasia, puns, and so forth, and hyperbola. Elegance is something more than mere affectation. It is deliberately artificial. But it need not be merely artificial. The writer of the following artifice pours out his figures of speech with a very pleasant gusto. Quote, good clothes are the embroidered trappings of pride, and good cheer the very arengo root of gluttony, so that fine backs and fat bellies are coach horses to 2 of the 7 deadly sins, in the boots of which coach lechery and sloth sit like the waiting maid. In a most desperate state, therefore, do tailors and cooks stand by means of their offices, for both those trades are apple squires to that couple of sins. The one invents more fantastic fashions than France hath worn since her first stone was laid. The other, more liquorish Epicurean dishes than were ever served up to Colonius's table. Did man, think you, come wrangling into the world about no better matters than all his lifetime to make privy searches in Burton Lane for whalebone doublets, or for pies of nightingale tongues in Heliogabalus his kitchen? No, no. The first suit of apparel that ever mortal man put on came neither from the mercer's shop nor from the merchant's warehouse. Adam's bill would have been taken then, sooner than a knight's bond now. Yet was he great in nobody's books for satin and velvets. The silkworms had something else to do in those days than to set up looms and be free of the weavers. His breeches were not so much worth as King Stephen's, that cost but a poor noble. For Adam's holiday hose and doublet were of no better stuff than plain fig leaves, and Eve's best gown of the same piece. There went but a pair of shears between them. An antiquary of this town has yet some of the powder of those leaves dried for show. Tailors then were none of the 12 companies. Their hall, that now is larger than some dorps among the Netherlands, was then no bigger than a Dutch butcher's shop. They durst not strike down their customers with large bills. Adam cared not an apple paring for all their lousy hems. There was then neither the Spanish slop, nor the skipper's galligason, the Switzer's blistered codpiece, nor the Danish sleeve sagging down like a Welsh wallet, the Italian's close strosser, nor the French standing collar, your treble quadruple Daedalian ruffs, nor your stiff-necked rabbitoes that have more arches for pride to row under than can stand under 5 London bridges, durst not then set themselves out in print, for the patent for starch could by no means be signed. Fashions then were counted a disease, and horses died of it. But now, thanks to folly, it is held the only rare physic, and the purest golden asses live upon it. End quote. Thomas Dekker, The Gull's Hornbook. Wit is not so deliberately artificial as mere elegance. The attitude is always a detached one, the thrust always in some manner oblique, and the effect one of artifice. But intellect or emotion is usually involved. Ironic wit, such as Swift's, even when engaged on the most trivial of subjects, is often a mask for deep feelings. Quote, "Perhaps the critics may accuse me of a defect in my following system of polite conversation, that there is one great ornament of discourse, whereof I have not produced a single example, which indeed I purposely omitted, for some reasons that I shall immediately offer, and if those reasons will not satisfy the male part of my gentle readers, the defect may be applied in some manner by an appendix to the second edition, which appendix shall be printed by itself and sold for 6d, stitched, and with a marble cover, that my readers may have no occasion to complain of being defrauded. The defect I mean is, my not having inserted into the body of my book all the oaths now most in fashion for embellishing discourse, especially since it could give no offense to the clergy, who are seldom or never admitted to these polite assemblies. And it must be allowed that oaths well chosen are not only very useful expletives to matter, but great ornaments of style. What I here offer in my own defense upon this important article will, I hope, be some extenuation of my fault. First, I reasoned with myself that a just collection of oaths, repeated as often as the fashion requires, must have enlarged this volume at least to double the bulk, whereby it would not only double the charge, but likewise make the volume less commodious for pocket carriage. Secondly, I have been assured by some judicious friends that themselves have known certain ladies to take offense, whether seriously or not, at too great a profusion of cursing and swearing, even when that kind of ornament was not improperly introduced, which I confess did startle me not a little, having never observed the like in compass of my own several acquaintance, at least for 20 years past. However, I was forced to submit to wiser judgments than my own. Thirdly, As this most useful treatise is calculated for all future times, I considered, in this maturity of my age, how great a variety of oaths I have heard since I began to study the world and to know men and manners. And here I found it to be true, what I have read in an ancient poet. For nowadays men change their oaths as often as they change their clothes. In short, oaths are the children of fashion. They are in some sense almost annuals, like what I have observed before of cant words, and I myself can remember about 40 different sets. The old stock oaths, I am confident, do not amount to above 45 or 50 at most, but the way of mingling and compounding them is almost as various as that of the alphabet. Sir John Perrot was the first man of quality whom I find upon record to have sworn by God's wounds. He lived in the reign of Queen Elizabeth, and was supposed to be a natural son of Henry VIII, who might also probably have been his instructor. This oath indeed still continues, and is a stock oath to this day. So do several others that have kept their natural simplicity. But infinitely the greater number has been so frequently changed and dislocated that if the inventors were now alive, they could hardly understand them. End quote. Jonathan Swift. Introduction to a complete collection of genteel and ingenious conversation. Irony, however, is not always so universal in its basis, nor so intelligent in its aim, as with Swift. It is, more often, the weapon of an exclusive egotism, of a mean and esoteric spirit that lacks common understanding and sympathy. This explains why it is used but sparingly by writers of true eloquence, Swift notwithstanding. But Swift is more often sardonic, and irony is not to be confused with the sardonic, which is a passionate state of mind far removed from the detachment of irony. The more innocent forms of wit play on unexpected conjunctions and oppositions of words. There is again a need for the sparing use of this type of wit. It grows wearisome and facetious if kept up too long. No one has better exploited both its uses and abuses than Mr. Chesterton. Quote, "Poetry deals with primal and conventional things. The hunger for bread, the love of a woman, the love of children, the desire for immortal life. If men really had new sentiments, poetry could not deal with them. If, let us say, a man did not feel a bitter craving to eat bread, but did, by way of substitute, feel a fresh original craving to eat brass fenders or mahogany tables, poetry could not express him. If a man, instead of falling in love with a woman, fell in love with a fossil or a sea anemone, poetry could not express him. Poetry can only express what is original in one sense, the sense in which we speak of original sin. It is original, not in the paltry sense of being new, but in the deeper sense of being old. It is original in the sense that it deals with origins." End quote. G.K. Chesterton, Robert Browning, page 99. But to return to true eloquence, it is subjective in its nature, and is fed by an abundant spring. It flows when some dominant idea has mastery of the mind, and orders the expression to the single purpose of that idea. Everything, every subordination and subtlety of style, is driven into one persuasive unity. These three conditions are necessary to eloquence. Firstly, an adequate theme; then, a sincere and impassioned mind; and lastly, a power of sustainment or pertinacity. It is idle to use eloquence upon a mean subject, for the result is always ludicrous. We speak ironically of people who wax eloquent, implying that their enthusiasm for a particular theme has betrayed them into a disproportionate mode of expression. Quote, "He is about to be struck down. A dark hand, gloved at first in folly, now intervenes. Exit Czar. Deliver him and all he loved to wounds and death. Belittle his efforts, asperse his conduct, insult his memory. But pause then to tell us who else was found capable. Who or what could guide the Russian state? Men gifted and daring, men ambitious and fierce, spirits audacious and commanding. Of these there was no lack. But none could answer the few plain questions on which the life and fame of Russia turned. With victory in her grasp, she fell upon the earth, devoured alive like Herod of old, by worms. But not in vain her valiant deeds. The giant mortally stricken had just time, with dying strength, to pass the torch eastward across the ocean to a new Titan, long sunk in doubt, who now arose and began ponderously to arm. The Russian Empire fell on March 16. On April 6, the United States entered the war." End quote. The Right Honorable Winston Churchill, The World Crisis, 1916 to 1918, Part 1, page 225. Such eloquence is false because it is artificial. It is one of the many pits into which a writer may fall if his conception of fine writing is not supported by an inner structure of fine thinking. Here the images are stale, the metaphors violent. The whole passage exhales a false dramatic atmosphere, descending to a childish use of the very rubrics of drama, with "exit Czar." There is a volley of rhetorical imperatives, followed by an inevitable ironic question. Then a volley of epithets, high-sounding and redundant. Then the simile of Herod's worms, too familiar to produce the calculated shudder. Then a line of verse, but not in vain, and so forth. And then a spate of still staler images, giant, torch, and Titan. And to complete the bathos, a plain and very literal statement of the cause of all this false eloquence. When this false eloquence has for aim not so much an aggrandization of the theme as an aggrandization of the self, then it may be described as declamation. An enthusiasm for a poor theme may be genuine to the extent of the writer's intelligence. He is then eloquent because he cannot rejoice in restraint. But in this second order of mock eloquence, the writer, suspecting the meanness of his theme, attempts to magnify it by grand phrases, thereby hoping to invest his own poor thoughts with the quality of this magnificence. Quote, "The eye, most illustrious sons of the Muses, most learned Oxonians, whose fame I have heard celebrated in all parts of the globe, the eye, the most amazing, that stupendous, that comprehending, that miraculous organ, the eye is the Proteus of the passions, the herald of the mind, the interpreter of the heart, and the window of the soul. The world was made for the eye, and the eye for the world. My subject is light, most illustrious sons of literature, intellectual light. Ah, my philosophical, metaphysical, my classical, mathematical, mechanical, my theological, my critical audience, my subject is the eye. You are the eye of England. England has two eyes, Oxford and Cambridge. They are the two eyes of England, the two intellectual eyes. You are the right eye of England, the elder sister in science. The eye is indefatigable. The eye is an angelic faculty. The eye, in this respect, is female." End quote. Chevalier Taylor's Oration at Oxford. The difference between true and false eloquence is easily perceived. and it is only under special conditions, such as those created by an excited crowd, that the pretense of eloquence can have any effect. It then serves to stir gross and uncriticized emotions into a state of self-intoxication, which has no relation to the real content of the expression. Indeed, such eloquence, when analyzed, will usually be found to consist of many high-sounding phrases of little inherent meaning. The use of false eloquence is particularly prevalent in politics and the press. Quote, "To the dead and to the living. On this, the 9th anniversary of the armistice, which ended the greatest and the most fateful of all wars, the heart of this world-wide empire turns in a special manner to the memory of those whose lives were the price of our deliverance. As there has been no struggle in our annals so terrible and so exacting, no danger so prolonged and imminent, no cause so great, no sacrifices so cruel, and no victory on which larger and more lasting issues hung, so there is no day in our calendar like to this. For over 4 years we stood on the edge of the abyss, of ruin as an empire, as a nation, perhaps of ruin as a race. The men we commemorate today saved us from that ruin by their death. The appeal is universal. Scarce a home in the land, from the most splendid of ancestral palaces to the humblest cottage or the poorest lodging in our towns, was unvisited in that dread time by the angel of death. He smote the best, a whole generation entering upon life in the flower of early manhood, and others, already husbands and fathers, the stay and the guardians of the widows and the orphans they have left. To the bereaved, first of all, this is a day of days, dedicated to the memory of their dead, a memory ever living with them, but by time and the everyday duties and occupations of life mercifully softened with the years. The annual testimony to the fallen, celebrated with such solemn and befitting rites as Church and State can give, bears recurrent witness to the full measure in which empire and nation share the grief and the gratitude of the mourners. There is no day on which all sorts and conditions of our people are so widely and so deeply moved by thoughts and feelings common to them all. The prayerful congregations in the churches on Sunday, the crowds which will gather round the cenotaph or attend the services and visit the tomb of the unknown warrior today, and those other crowds which will assemble in their own churches or about their own local monuments through the provinces and through all lands where the flag flies, are filled according to their gifts and their experiences by the same spirit, the same memories, and the same hopes. End quote. The Times, November 11, 1927. The writer of ad hoc eloquence such as this probably deserves our sympathy rather than our scorn. We need not analyze the passage in detail. It is rather better than Mr. Churchill's false eloquence, because it is not so violent. But it is interesting to note in what small but significant ways a writer in this mood betrays himself. Why, at the end of the second sentence, does he write, "No day in our calendar like to this"? Like this is the natural expression. The to is inserted either to swell out the rhythm or as a reminiscence of the biblical unto. Violence was the general characteristic of the first example, exaggeration of the second. This third example is unctuous. Eloquence may inhere in a phrase, as, quote, "A noble and puissant nation rousing herself like a strong man after sleep, and shaking her invisible locks." End quote. Milton. But the two first named conditions of eloquence, an adequate theme and a sincere and impassioned mind, really imply a mood which is sustained within the extent of the subject. An adequate theme, like victory, courage, beauty, God, nature, or the infinity of space, cannot be confined to a few paltry phrases, but creates a mood of expansive fury. But there is another reason inherent in the circumstances of eloquence. A noble theme does not unite with a sincere and impassioned mind by casual chance, but they come together naturally by a process of fruition which is expressed in the word character. The French have a phrase, grandeur d'âme, which expresses this quality better still, but a literal translation, greatness of soul, will not serve our purpose very well. Soul is an abused word, and because of the vagueness of its meaning and the sentimentality of its emotional associations, is better avoided in scientific discussion. And if we carefully distinguish our word character, not only from its legitimate homophones, but also from the word personality, with which it is often loosely interchanged, we shall find a firm and proper connotation of great use in the present context. An individual develops in two ways which are most simply regarded as the self-activity of his body and the activity of that body in relation to an outer environment. In the first way, he feels and thinks and acts instinctively. He develops a personality. But this is purely a receptive or passive state. To emerge from this state into a state of action which is creative, it is necessary to formulate and direct the flow of feelings, thoughts, and instincts. With this idea of form or discipline, there enters the conception of character. But character is not formed by a blind reaction to circumstances. It wants an energy or warmth to animate it. Character begins with purposive action. Action can never for long be disjointed or unrelated. An individual whose every action was separate and illogical would cease to exist as a rational being. He would be mad. Luckily, the consistency of our environment early in life insists on the repetition of actions, and in this way we form habits. The general body of our habits is our behavior. When behavior becomes purposive, it acquires a pattern or consistent shape, and this pattern we recognize as character. A character is complete when the play and interplay of its instincts, emotions, and actions is consistent and harmonious. A man of personality can formulate ideals, but only a man of character can achieve them. Personality can be expressed in a personal style, as already indicated in Chapter 12, but true eloquence is more properly associated with the man of character. Of true eloquence I shall give two examples, but to appreciate one of the qualities of eloquence, namely its sustainment throughout the duration of a theme, it would be necessary to quote whole works, not dismembered fragments. Quote, "As those images were limned in my mind, the morning star now almost arising in the east, I found my thoughts in a mild and quiet calm, and not long after, my senses, one by one forgetting their uses, began to give themselves over to rest, leaving me in a still and peaceable sleep, if sleep it may be called, where the mind awaking is carried with free wings from out fleshly bondage. For heavy lids had not long covered their lights, when methought, nay, sure I was, where I might discern all in this great all, the large compass of rolling circles, the brightness and continual motion of those rubies of the night, which by their distance here below cannot be perceived. The silver countenance of the wandering moon, shining by another's light, the hanging of the earth, as environed with a girdle of crystal, the sun enthronized in the midst of the planets, eye of the heavens, gem of this precious ring, the world. But whilst with wonder and amazement I gazed on those celestial splendors, and the beaming lamps of that glorious temple, like a poor countryman brought from his solitary mountains and flocks to behold the magnificence of some great city, there was presented to my sight a man, as in the spring of his years, with that self-same grace, comely feature, majestic look, which the late blank was wont to have, on whom I had no sooner fixed mine eyes, when, like one planet stroken, I became amazed. But he, with a mild demeanor, and voice surpassing all human sweetness, appeared, methought, to say, "What is it doth thus pain and perplex thee? Is it the remembrance of death, the last period of wretchedness, and entry into these happy places? The lantern which lighteneth men to see the mystery of the blessedness of spirits, and that glory which transcendeth the courtain of things visible? Is thy fortune below on that dark globe, which scarce by the smallness of it appeareth here, so great that thou art heartbroken and dejected to leave it? What if thou wert to leave behind the blank, so glorious in the eye of the world, yet but a mote of dust encircled with a pond, as that of mine so loving blank, such great hopes? These had been apparent occasions of lamenting, and but apparent? Dost thou think thou leavest life too soon? Death is best young. Things fair and excellent are not of long endurance upon earth. Who liveth well liveth long. Souls most beloved of their Maker are soonest relieved from the bleeding cares of life, and with almost a spherical swiftness wafted through the surges of humane miseries. Opinion, that great enchantress and paiser of things, not as they are, but as they seem, hath not in anything more than in the conceit of death abused man, who must not measure himself and esteem his estate after his earthly being, which is but a dream. For though he be born on earth, he is not born for the earth, more than the embryon for the mother's womb. It plaineth to be relieved of its bands, and to come into the light of this world. And man waileth to be loosed from the chains with which he is fettered in that valley of vanities. It is nothing knoweth whither it is to go, nor aught of the beauty of the visible works of God, neither doth man of the magnificence of the intellectual world above, into which, as by a midwife, he is directed by death. Fools, which think that this fair and admirable frame, so variously disposed, so rightly marshalled, so strongly maintained, enriched with so many excellencies, not only for necessity, but for ornament and delight, was by that supreme wisdom brought forth, that all things in a circulary course should be and not be, arise and dissolve, and thus continue, as if they were so many shadows carelessly cast out, and caused by the encountering of those superior celestial bodies, changing only their fashion and shape, or fantastical imageries, or shades of faces into crystal. But more fools they, which believe that he doth no other ways regard this his work than as a theatre, raised for bloody sword players, wrestlers, chasers of timorous, and combaters of terrible beasties, delighting in the daily torments, sorrows, distress, and misery of mankind. No, no, the eternal wisdom did make man an excellent creature, though he fain would unmake himself, and return unto nothing. And though he seek his felicity among the reasonless wights, he hath fixed it above. He brought him into the world as a master to a sumptuous, well-ordered, and furnished inn, a prince to a populous and rich empire, a pilgrim and spectator to a stage full of delightful wonders and wonderful delights. And to some emperor or great monarch, when he hath raised any stately city, the work being achieved, is wont to set his image in the midst of it, to be admired and gazed upon. No otherwise did the sovereign of this world, the fabric of it perfected, place man, a great miracle, formed to his own pattern, in the midst of this spacious and admirable city, by the divine splendor of his reason, to be an interpreter and trunchman of his creation, and admired and reverenced by all his other creatures. God containeth all in him, as the midst of all. Inferior things be in man more noble than they exist, superior things more meanly, celestial things favor him, earthly things are vassalled unto him. He is the knot and band of both. Neither is it possible that both of them have peace with man, if man have peace with him who made the covenant between them and him. He was made that he might, in the glass of the world, behold the infinite goodness, power, magnificence, and glory of his Maker, and beholding, know, and knowing, love, and loving, enjoy, and to hold the earth of him as of his Lord paramount, never ceasing to remember and praise him. It exceedeth the compass of conceit to think that wisdom, which made everything so orderly in these parts, should make a confusion in the whole, and the chief masterpiece, how bringing forth so many excellencies for man, it should bring forth man for baseness and misery. And no less strange were it, that so long life should be given to trees, beasts, and the birds of the air, creatures inferior to man, which have less use of it, and which cannot judge of this goodly fabric, and that it should be denied to man, unless there were another manner of living prepared for him, in a place more noble and excellent. William Drummond of Hathornton, A Cypress Grove. It was as if they had gathered there into a vast deafening chorus. I shall never forget how, speaking, that is, for my own sense, they filled those vast halls with the influence rather of some complicated sound, diffused and reverberant, than of such visibilities as one could directly deal with. To distinguish among these, in the charged and colored and confounding air, was difficult. It discouraged and defied, which was, doubtless, why my impression originally best entertained was that of those magnificent parts of the great gallery simply not inviting us to distinguish. They only arched over us, in the wonder of their endless golden riot and relief, figured and flourished in perpetual revolution, breaking into great high-hung circles and symmetries of squandered picture, opening into deep outward embrasures that threw off the rest of monumental Paris somehow as a told story, a sort of wrought effect, or bold ambiguity for a vista, and yet held it there, at every point, as a vast bright gauge, even at moments of felt adventure of experience. This comes to saying that, in those beginnings, I felt myself most happily cross that bridge over to style, constituted by the wondrous Gallery d'Apollon, drawn out for me as a long but assured initiation, and seeming to form with its supreme coved ceiling and inordinately shining parquet a prodigious tube or tunnel through which I inhaled little by little, that is, again and again, a general sense of glory. The glory meant ever so many things at once, not only beauty and art and supreme design, but history and fame and power. The world, in fine, raised to the richest and noblest expression. The world there was at the same time, by an odd extension or intensification, the local present fact, to my small imagination, of the Second Empire, which was, for my notified consciousness, new and queer and perhaps even wrong, but on the spot so amply radiant and elegant that it took under its protection with a splendor of insolence, the state and ancestry of the whole scene, profiting thus, to one's dim historic vision, confusedly though it might be, by the unparalleled luxury and variety of its heritage. But who shall count the sources at which an intense young fancy, when a young fancy is intense, capriciously, absurdly drinks? So that the effect is, in 20 connections, that of a love philter, or fear philter, which fixes for the senses their supreme symbol of the fair or the strange. The Gallery d'Apollon became for years what I can only term a splendid scene of things, even of the quite irrelevant, or, as might be, almost unworthy. And I recall to this hour, with the last vividness, what a precious part it played for me, and exactly by that continuity of honor, on my awakening, in a summer dawn many years later, to the fortunate, the instantaneous recovery and capture of the most appalling, yet most admirable nightmare of my life. The climax of this extraordinary experience, which stands alone for me as a dream adventure, founded in the deepest, quickest, clearest act of cogitation and comparison, act indeed of life-saving energy, as well as in unutterable fear, was the sudden pursuit, through an open door, along a huge high salon, of a just dimly described figure that retreated in terror before my rush and dash, a glare of inspired reaction from irresistible but shameful dread. Out of the room I had a moment before been desperately, and all the more abjectly defending, by the push of my shoulder against hard pressure on the lock and bar from the other side. The lucidity, not to say the sublimity, of the crisis had consisted of the great thought that I, in my appalled state, was probably still more appalling than the awful agent, creature, or presence, whatever he was, whom I had guessed, in the suddenest wild start from my sleep, to be making for my place of rest. The triumph of my impulse, perceived in a flash, as I acted on it by myself at a bound, forcing the door outward, was the grand thing. But the great point of the whole was the wonder of my final recognition. Routed, dismayed, the tables turned upon him by my so surpassing him for straight aggression and dire intention, my visitant was already but a diminished spot in the long perspective, the tremendous, glorious hall, as I say, over the far gleaming floor of which, cleared for the occasion of its great line of priceless vitrines down the middle, he sped for his life, while a great storm of thunder and lightning played through the deep embrasures of high windows at the right. The lightning that revealed the retreat revealed also the wondrous place, and by the same amazing play, my young imaginative life in it of long before, the sense of which, deep within me, had kept it whole, preserved it to this thrilling use. For what in the world were the deep embrasures and the so polished floor but those of the Gallery d'Apollon of my childhood? The scene of something, I had vaguely then felt it. Well I might, since it was to be the scene of that immense hallucination. Henry James, A Small Boy and Others, pages 360 through 364. These two examples of eloquence are extremely different in inspiration, but agree in their rhetorical characteristics, in their sustained periods and long rhythmical cadences, in their intense or lyrical phrases, the silver countenance of the wandering moon, a poor countryman brought from his solitary mountains and flocks, the courtaine of things visible, a spherical swiftness, the charged and colored and confounding air, high-hung circles and symmetries of squandered picture, a vast bright gauge, the state and ancientry of the whole scene, and in the general sense of glory which each passage radiates. Eloquence is, indeed, closely related to glory, for one is the expression in deeds, as the other is in words, of the same animating principle of human conduct. End of Part 2, Chapter 13.
Part 2, Chapter 14 of English Prose Style. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. English Prose Style by Herbert Reed. Tradition. The ordinary use of the word tradition implies a handing down of something vital, a torch lit in the remote past, whose light is the only light capable of guiding us in the particular darkness surrounding us at the moment of present existence. There is a good deal to be said for this conception. It implies continuity. It also implies activity. It is not, however, completely satisfactory, if only for the fact that it makes no provision for the athletes of the metaphor, who race from point to point with a burning brand. It assumes, so to speak, that a runner is miraculously there at the relay point to seize the torch from the exhausted forerunner. But such an assumption is a begging of the whole question. Quote, if the only form of tradition, of handing down, consisted in following the ways of the immediate generation before us in a blind or timid adherence to its successes, tradition should positively be discouraged. We have seen many such simple currents soon lost in the sand. and novelty is better than repetition. Tradition is a matter of much wider significance. It cannot be inherited, and if you want it, you must obtain it by great labor. It involves, in the first place, the historical sense, and the historical sense involves a perception not only of the pastness of the past, but of its presence. The historical sense compels a man to write not merely for his own generation in his bones, but with a feeling that the whole of the literature of Europe, from Homer, and within it the whole of the literature of his own country, has a simultaneous existence, and composes a simultaneous order." T.S. Eliot, The Sacred Wood, 1920, Matthew, pages 44 and 45. In this passage, and more generally in the essay from which it is taken, Mr. Eliot has succeeded in showing how little tradition is a mere question of blind following, but is rather the presence in the writer of a particular kind of sensibility. It is a sensibility not only to historical continuity, but also to historical wholeness or integrity. To realize this age-long integrity is necessarily to feel the irrelevance of those idiosyncrasies upon which, as we saw in Chapter 12, the personal writer depends. It is only possible to come to this realization by a process of education, by the formation of what, in the last chapter, we have described as character. Through the interplay of sensibility and character, there arises this particular style which we describe as traditional. In a more general sense, such interplay gives rise to the phenomenon of taste. A tradition in prose, as in poetic style, first takes shape when a body of critical opinion crystallizes around the idiomatic structure of a language. For some time, influences, personal, imitative, even social and religious, have been molding a language. A point occurs when suddenly it is realized that these influences have resulted in an appropriateness, in a fit relation of sound, sense, and conversational ease. Such a moment came in English literature in the second half of the 17th century, and particularly in the person of Dryden, who has been commonly recognized as the starting point of the main traditional style in English. This is not to say that there were not writers before his time who were contributory to this tradition, for besides Tillotson, whom Dryden acknowledged, too generously, as his master, there is what I am tempted to call the whole firmament of fixed stars: Bunyan, Milton, Taylor, Brown, Donne, Bacon, Hooker, the Bible translators, and Mallory. Among these authors there are, indeed, visible relationships, and even, as for example in the case of Bunyan and the English Bible, direct descents. But there is no corporate literary sense. Most of our early writers are solitary writers, sometimes, therefore, idiosyncratic, like Sir Thomas Browne, but more often instructed by some conscious discipline. But by Dryden's time the corporate sense had been born. Literature had become a profession, and something like professional pride was engendered. Dryden himself was the first writer to be wholly conscious of this sense, and it is a tribute to his real greatness that he himself became its first exemplar. Let us now examine a series of fairly short but typical passages from those writers whom we may regard as constituting the English tradition, beginning with Dryden. Quote, "But to return from this digression to a farther account of my poem, I must crave leave to tell you, that as I have endeavored to adorn it with noble thoughts, so much more to express those thoughts with elocution. The composition of all poems is, or ought to be, of wit, and wit in the poet, or wit writing, if you will give me leave to use a school distinction, is no other than the faculty of imagination in the writer, which, like a nimble spaniel, beats over and ranges through the field of memory till it springs the quarry it hunted after, or without metaphor, which searches over all the memory for the species or ideas of those things which it designs to represent. Wit written is that which is well defined, the happy result of thought, or product of imagination. But to proceed from wit, and the general notion of it, to the proper wit of an heroic or historical poem, I judge it chiefly to consist in the delightful imaginings of persons, actions, passions, or things. 'Tis not the jerk or sting of an epigram, nor the seeming contradiction of a poor antithesis, the delight of an ill-judging audience in a play of rhyme, nor the jingle of a more poor paronomasia. Neither is it so much the morality of a grave sentence, affected by Lucan, but more sparingly used by Virgil. But it is some lively and apt description, dressed in such colors of speech that it sets before your eyes the absent object as perfectly and more delightfully than nature. So then the first happiness of the poet's imagination is properly invention, or finding of the thought. The second is fancy, or the variation, deriving, or moulding of that thought, as the judgment represents it proper to the subject. The third is elocution, or the art of clothing and adorning that thought, so found and varied in apt, significant, and sounding words. The quickness of the imagination is seen in the invention, the fertility in the fancy, and the accuracy in the expression. For the two first of these, Ovid is famous amongst the poets; for the latter, Virgil. Ovid images more often the movements and affections of the mind, either combating between two contrary passions, or extremely discomposed by one. His words, therefore, are the least part of his care, for he pictures nature in disorder, with which the study and choice of words is inconsistent. There is the proper wit of dialogue or discourse, and consequently of the drama, where all that is said is supposed to be the effect of sudden thought, which, though it excludes not the quickness of wit in repartees, yet admits not a too curious election of words, too frequent allusions, or use of tropes, or, in fine, anything that shows remoteness of thought, or labor in the writer. On the other side, Virgil speaks not so often to us in the person of another, like Ovid, but in his own. He relates almost all things as from himself, and thereby gains more liberty than the other to express his thoughts with all the graces of elocution, to write more figuratively, and to confess as well the labor as the force of his imagination." John Dryden, Preface to Annus Mirabilis. "Nothing is more pleasant to the fancy than to enlarge itself by degrees in its contemplation of the various proportions which its several objects bear to each other, when it compares the body of man to the bulk of the whole earth, the earth to the circle it describes round the sun, that circle to the sphere of the fixed stars, the sphere of the fixed stars to the circuit of the whole creation itself to the infinite space that is everywhere diffused about it. And when the imagination works downward, and considers the bulk of a human body in respect of an animal, 100 times less than a mite, the particular limbs of such an animal, the different springs which actuate the limbs, the spirits which set these springs a-going, and the proportional minuteness of these several parts, before they have arrived at their full growth and perfection. But if, after all this, we take the least particle of these animal spirits, and consider its capacity of being wrought into a world that shall contain within these narrow dimensions a heaven and earth, stars and planets, and every different species of living creatures in the same analogy and proportion they bear to each other in our own universe, such a speculation, by reason of its nicety, appears ridiculous to those who have not turned their thoughts that way, though at the same time it is founded on no less than the evidence of a demonstration. Nay, we may yet carry it farther, and discover in the smallest particle of this little world a new and inexhausted fund of matter, capable of being spun out into another universe." Joseph Addison, Spectator, No. 420. "Rasselas went often to an assembly of learned men, who met at stated times to unbend their minds and compare their opinions. Their manners were somewhat coarse, but their conversation was instructive, and their disputations acute. though sometimes too violent, and often continued till neither controvertist remembered upon what question they began. Some faults were almost general among them. Everyone was desirous to dictate to the rest, and everyone was pleased to hear the genius or knowledge of another depreciated. In this assembly Rasselas was relating his interview with the hermit, and the wonder with which he heard him censure a course of life which he had so deliberately chosen, and so laudably followed. The sentiments of the hearers were various. Some were of opinion that the folly of his choice had been justly punished by condemnation to perpetual perseverance. One of the youngest among them, with great vehemence, pronounced him a hypocrite. Some talked of the right of society to the labor of individuals, and considered retirement as a desertion of duty. Others readily allowed that there was a time when the claims of the people were satisfied, and when a man might properly sequester himself to review his life and purify his heart. One who appeared more affected with the narrative than the rest thought it likely that the hermit would in a few years go back to his retreat, and perhaps, if shame did not restrain, or death intercept him, return once more from his retreat into the world. For the hope of happiness, said he, is so strongly impressed that the longest experience is not able to efface it. Of the present state, whatever it be, we feel and are forced to confess the misery. Yet when the same state is again at a distance, imagination paints it as desirable. But the time will surely come when desire will be no longer our torment, and no man shall be wretched but by his own fault. This, said a philosopher, who had heard him with tokens of great impatience, is the present condition of a wise man. The time is already come when none are wretched but by their own fault. Nothing is more idle than to inquire after happiness, which nature has kindly placed within our reach. The way to be happy is to live according to nature, in obedience to that universal and unalterable law with which every heart is originally impressed, which is not written on it by precept, but engraven by destiny, not instilled by education, but infused at our nativity. He that lives according to nature will suffer nothing from the delusions of hope or importunities of desire. He will receive and reject with equability of temper, and act or suffer as the reason of things shall alternately prescribe. Other men may amuse themselves with subtle definitions or intricate ratiocination. Let them learn to be wise by easier means. Let them observe the hind of the forest and the linnet of the grove. Let them consider the life of animals whose motions are regulated by instinct. They obey their guide and are happy. Let us therefore at length cease to dispute and learn to live. Throw away the encumbrance of precepts, which they who utter them with so much pride and pomp do not understand, and carry with us this simple and intelligible maxim, that deviation from nature is deviation from happiness. When he had spoken, he looked round him with a placid air, and enjoyed the consciousness of his own beneficence. Sir, said the prince with great modesty, as I, like all the rest of mankind, am desirous of felicity, my closest attention has been fixed upon your discourse. I doubt not the truth of a position which a man so learned has so confidently advanced. Let me only know what it is to live according to nature. When I find young men so humble and so docile, said the philosopher, I can deny them no information which my studies have enabled me to afford. To live according to nature is to act always with due regard to the fitness arising from the relations and qualities of causes and effects, to concur with the great and unchangeable scheme of universal felicity, to cooperate with the general disposition and tendency of the present system. The prince soon found that this was one of the sages whom he should understand less as he heard him longer. He therefore bowed and was silent, and the philosopher, supposing him satisfied and the rest vanquished, rose up and departed with the air of a man that had cooperated with the present system." Samuel Johnson, Rasselas. The renewal, or perhaps the improvement, of my English life was embittered by the alteration of my own feelings. At the age of 21 I was, in my proper station of a youth, delivered from the yoke of education, and delighted with the comparative state of liberty and affluence. My filial obedience was natural and easy, and in the gay prospect of futurity my ambition did not extend beyond the enjoyment of my books, my leisure, and my patrimonial estate, undisturbed by the cares of a family and the duties of a profession. But in the militia I was armed with power. In my travels I was exempt from control, and as I gradually passed my 30th year, I began to feel the desire of being master in my own house. The most gentle authority will sometimes frown without reason. The most cheerful submission will sometimes murmur without cause. And such is the law of our imperfect nature, that we must either command or obey, that our personal liberty is supported by the obsequiousness of our own dependents. While so many of my acquaintance were married or in Parliament, or advancing with a rapid step in the various roads of honor and fortune, I stood alone, immovable and insignificant. For after the monthly meeting of 1770, I had even withdrawn myself from the militia by the resignation of an empty and barren commission. My temper is not susceptible of envy, and the view of successful merit has always excited my warmest applause. The miseries of a vacant life were never known to a man whose hours were insufficient for the inexhaustible pleasures of study. But I lamented that at the proper age I had not embraced the lucrative pursuits of the law or of trade, the chances of civil office or India adventure, or even the fat slumbers of the church. And my repentance became more lively as the loss of time was more irretrievable. Experience showed me the use of grafting my private consequence on the importance of a great professional body. The benefits of those firm connections which are cemented by hope and interest, by gratitude and emulation, by the mutual exchange of services and favors. From the emoluments of a profession I might have derived an ample fortune, or a competent income, instead of being stinted to the same narrow allowance, to be increased only by an event which I sincerely deprecated. The progress in the knowledge of our domestic disorders aggravated my anxiety, and I began to apprehend that I might be left in my old age without the fruits either of industry or inheritance." Edward Gibbon, Memoirs of My Life and Writings. If any man had a right to look down upon the lower accomplishments as beneath his attention, it was certainly Michelangelo. Nor can it be thought strange that such a mind should have slighted or have been withheld from paying due attention to all those graces and embellishments of art which have diffused such luster over the works of other painters. It must be acknowledged, however, that together with these, which we wish he had more attended to, he has rejected all the false, though spacious ornaments, which disgrace the works of even the most esteemed artists, and I will venture to say that even when those higher excellencies are more known and cultivated by the artists and patrons of arts, his fame and credit will increase with our increasing knowledge. His name will then be held in the same veneration as it was in the enlightened age of Leo X, and it is remarkable that the reputation of this truly great man has been continually declining as the art itself has declined. For I must remark to you that it has long been much on the decline, and that our only hope of its revival will consist in your being thoroughly sensible of its depravation and decay. It is to Michelangelo that we owe even the existence of Raphael. It is to him Raphael owes the grandeur of his style. He was taught by him to elevate his thoughts and to conceive his subjects with dignity. His genius, however, formed to blaze and to shine, might, like fire in combustible matter, forever have lain dormant, if it had not caught a spark by its contact with Michelangelo, and though it never burst out with his extraordinary heat and vehemence, yet it must be acknowledged to be a more pure, regular, and chaste flame. Though our judgment must, upon the whole, decide in favor of Raphael, yet he never takes such a firm hold and entire possession of the mind as to make us desire nothing else and to feel nothing wanting. The effect of the capital works of Michelangelo perfectly corresponds what Bouchardon said he felt from reading Homer. His whole frame appeared to himself to be enlarged, and all nature which surrounded him diminished to atoms." Sir Joshua Reynolds, The Fifth Discourse. "If an age of religion has thus everywhere, as I venture to surmise, been preceded by an age of magic, it is natural that we should inquire what causes have led mankind, or rather a portion of them, to abandon magic as a principle of faith and practice, and to betake themselves to religion instead. When we reflect upon the multitude, the variety, and the complexity of facts to be explained, and the scantiness of our information regarding them, we shall be ready to acknowledge that a full and satisfactory solution of so profound a problem is hardly to be hoped for, and that the most we can do in the present state of our knowledge is to hazard a more or less plausible conjecture. With all due diffidence, then, I would suggest that a tardy recognition of the inherent falsehood and barrenness of magic set the more thoughtful part of mankind to cast about for a truer theory of nature, and a more fruitful method of turning her resources to account. The shrewder intelligences must in time have come to perceive that magical ceremonies and incantations did not really affect the results which they were designed to produce, and which the majority of their simpler fellows still believed that they did actually produce. This great discovery of the inefficacy of magic must have wrought a radical, though probably slow, revolution in the minds who had the sagacity to make it. The discovery amounted to this, that men for the first time recognized their inability to manipulate at pleasure certain natural forces which hitherto they had believed to be completely within their control. It was a confession of human ignorance and weakness. Man saw that he had taken for causes what were no causes, and that all his efforts to work by means of these imaginary causes had been vain. His painful toil had been wasted. His curious ingenuity had been squandered to no purpose. He had been pulling at strings to which nothing was attached. He had been marching, as he thought, straight to the goal, while in reality he had only been treading in a narrow circle. Not that the effects which he had striven so hard to produce did not continue to manifest themselves. They were still produced, but not by him. The rain still fell on the thirsty ground, the sun still pursued its daily, and the moon her nightly journey across the sky. The silent procession of the seasons still moved in light and shadow, in cloud and sunshine, across the earth. Men were still born to labor and sorrow, and still, after a brief sojourn here, were gathered to their fathers in the long home hereafter. All things indeed went on as before, yet all seemed different to him, from whose eyes the old scales had fallen. For he could no longer cherish the pleasing illusion that it was he who guided the earth and the heaven in their courses, and that they would cease to perform their great evolutions were he to take his feeble hand from the wheel. In the death of his enemies and his friends, he no longer saw a proof of the resistless potency of his own or of hostile enchantments. He now knew that friends and foes alike had succumbed to a force stronger than any that he could wield, and in obedience to a destiny which he was powerless to control." Sir James G. Frazer, The Golden Bough, pages 56 and 57. Abridged edition. It is impossible in the course of these short extracts to feel the full flow of a traditional style. As we read an author, say Dryden or Addison or Gibbon, a distinct knowledge of the pattern of his style is formed in our mind. and between such authors as I have quoted, one can easily perceive a similarity of pattern. It is not only a similarity, but also a development. At each change of author, the pattern, though formed of the same elements, is given a slight turn, which we may ascribe to the author's personality. But the author is conscious all the time of a certain objective mold into which he is content to fit as much of his expression as the mold will take. Here and there a phrase slips over, such as "yet admits not a too curious election of words," which is purely Dryden's, or to unbend their minds and compare their opinions, the consciousness of his own beneficence, the air of a man that had cooperated with the present system, which are purely Johnson's. But these and other phrases, which could be quoted from these authors, are phrases only. Tradition is concerned more with the tone and temper of expression, and so with the period rather than the phrase, with the paragraph rather than the period, and with the general manner of the whole rather than the conduct of the parts. It is embodied in a sense of personal decency rather than a code of rhetoric. It is an ideal of character rather than a system of rules. But it is a character which expresses itself consciously, as implied in the word ideal. It is not the humor of Johnson, nor the charm and personality of the writers we have discussed in Chapter 12. It is, that is to say, a positive style, and when Francis Jeffrey criticized Swift, it was from the point of view of this positiveness. Quote, "Of his style it has been usual to speak with great and, we think, exaggerated praise. It is less mellow than Dryden's, less elegant than Pope's or Addison's, less noble than Lord Bolingbroke's, and utterly without the glow and loftiness which belonged to our earlier masters. It is radically a low and homely style, without grace and without affectation, and chiefly remarkable for a great choice and profusion of common words and expressions." End quote. That is not altogether just to regard Swift's style from this point of view, I have remarked in my introduction, in relation to the hypothesis of pure prose. But Jeffrey, himself a follower of the tradition he is praising, is justified if we allow the force of that tradition. And its force is the force that comes of all disciplines, all dogma, and all coordinate aims. Nothing in the end is so wearisome as idiosyncrasy and waywardness. The universal alone is stable, and a universal style is an impersonal style. That tradition is not the only discipline is proved by such writers as Swift and the author of Erewhon, whose discipline is really extra-literary, a disciple of mind rather than of expression, of science rather than of taste. But this latter kind of control is only possible to rare individuals, to whom it comes by nature rather than by training. Less talented writers will, like Gibbon or like Stevenson, set themselves a standard and sedulously ape it. Such dependence has serious defects. It leads to a mechanical structure, to timidity of phrasing, a timidity not inconsistent with an occasional kick over the traces, and rigidity of rhythm. It is apt to sacrifice fluidity to formality. It is obvious that a tradition which can control personality in the interests of uniformity can also mark the absence of personality by wearing the outer garments of such an uniformity. Given an easy command of words, it is not difficult to build them into a shoddy structure which, in appearance, at least, is indistinguishable from real architecture. Nothing in any art is so easy to fake as the grand manner. Coleridge perceived this. Quote, "After the Revolution, the spirit of the nation became much more commercial than it had been before. A learned body, or clerisy as such, gradually disappeared, and literature in general began to be addressed to the common miscellaneous public. That public had been accustomed to and required a strong stimulus, and to meet the requisitions of the public taste, a style was produced which, by combining triteness of thought with singularity and excessive manner of expression, was calculated at once to soothe ignorance and to flatter vanity. The thought was carefully kept down to the immediate apprehension of the commonest understanding, and the dress was as anxiously arranged for the purpose of making the thought appear something very profound. The essence of this style consisted in a mock antithesis, that is, in opposition of mere sounds, in a rage for personification. The abstract made animate, far-fetched metaphors, strange phrases, metrical scraps, and everything, in short, but genuine prose. Lecture 14. The tradition we have described, that beginning with Dryden and still prevalent today, is only one tradition. Other traditions are possible, though perhaps only by evolution. Here again the analogy of manners in society would seem to hold good. There is, after all, a difference of tone between Dryden and Sir Joshua Reynolds, but it is difficult to know how much of this difference should be ascribed to a difference in personality. Not everything, for merely a change in the face value or purchasing power of words is enough to effect a difference in tone, and therefore in tradition. But discounting these temporal changes, we must still hazard this axiom, that in matters of style, tradition is a good instrument, but a bad machine. Good as a mold, but no matrix. It is a discipline that needs to be informed by the force of mental energy, clear vision, and a fine sensibility. End of Part 2, Chapter 14. Conclusion. Chapter 15 of English Prose Style. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. English Prose Style by Herbert Reed. Conclusion. There is a famous passage in the Biographia Literaria where Coleridge, speaking of the poet's images, remarks that these do not of themselves characterize the poet. Quote, "They become proofs of original genius only so far as they are modified by a predominant passion, or by associated thoughts or images awakened by that passion." End quote. Coleridge had in mind the unity of a poetic composition, and he contends that such unity is imposed on the poet's expression only by virtue of a sustained mood or passion. What Coleridge had in mind, on an intense scale, for the individual composition, and for poetry, I wish to extend on a less intense scale to the general conspectus of a writer's prose. I wish to say, adopting Coleridge's phrase, that all the modes of rhetoric, which we have been considering, become proofs of original genius only so far as they are modified by a predominant passion in the writer. The sense of the quality of words, the use of appropriate epithets and images, the organization of the period, the paragraph, and the plot, the arts of exposition and of narrative, all the gifts of thought and sensibility. These are only dry perfections, unless they are moved by a spirit which is neither intelligence nor emotion, but the sustained power of reason. And by reason, in this context, I do not mean ratiocination or rationality, but, as I have said in another connection, the widest evidence of the senses and of all processes and instincts developed in the history of man. It is the sum total of awareness, ordained and ordered to some specific end or object of attention. Such a quality in a writer is no innate instinct, but a conscious achievement. It is more than character, because it necessarily implies intelligence, and it is more than personality, because it necessarily implies a world of absolute ideals. A life of reason is more than a life of self-development, because it is also a life of self-devotion, of service to outer and autocratic abstractions. This is merely to say that a good style is not the making of a great writer, and the corollary is that a great writer is always a good stylist. The greatest English prose writers, Swift, Milton, Taylor, Hooker, Berkeley, Shelley, are great not only by virtue of their prose style, but also by virtue of the profundity of their outlook on the world. And these are not separable and distinct virtues, but two aspects of one reality. The thought seems to mold and accentuate the style, and the style reacts to mold and accentuate the thought. It is one process of creation, one art, one aim. In the last chapter but one I have defined true eloquence as determined by the dominance of some idea in the mind of the writer, which orders the expression to the single purpose of that idea. If for idea we substitute the word ideal, we have a definition of the quality which I am concerned with now. Not merely ideal, but a life of ideals is perhaps a more accurate conception. But even this is a dangerous phrase, for it must be further desiderated that the ideals are intelligent, not sentimental or unreal. Sentimental ideals will, it is true, give rise to a predominating passion of a sort. But there is a hierarchy in everything, and the higher the concept, the more difficult it is to differentiate the subtle gradations of value. A certain degree of passion is to be found in a writer like Walter Pater. His style is everywhere definitely his own. It is character, and it has beauty, and we feel that such an outer unity must spring from an inner unity. But how describe this inner unity in Pater's case? It is a subtle matter, and I doubt if anything more considerable than just a self-consuming passion for style, an educated taste, an abnormal sensibility for the tonal value of words could be deduced. These qualities are not to be despised, but contrast them with the qualities of another writer whose style is equally integral and equally eloquent. I mean John Henry Newman. Newman's aim in writing was almost directly contrary to Pater's. He tells us that he has never written for writing's sake, but that his one and single desire and aim had been to do what is so difficult, viz., to explain clearly and exactly my meaning. This has been the whole principle of all my corrections and rewritings. The eloquence that is undeniably his, one of the most persuasive in English literature, in the first instance owes little to conscious rhetoric or composition. It is a spirit, in his case definitely recognizable as the religious spirit, which finds the modes of its eloquence inherent in its moods. Newman's style being in its lowest terms an effort after a clear and exact representation of his thought, it follows that not a little of the fascination it exercises is the influence of the writer's beautiful and subtle mind, which it clothes in light and transparent vesture. In kind, it is the eloquence of Vanzetti, but unlike Vanzetti's eloquence, it is not created by a stress of emotion, but is a sustained state, a predominating passion always, in this context, implying control. Newman is perhaps not a good example to take, except as a contrast to Pater. Newman's passion is too subtle and too little understood. Swift is easier of comprehension, and admirable for predominance. I do not for a moment pretend that his sardonic humor is a simple matter, or one for vulgar explication. But whatever the diagnosis, its symptoms are plain to be seen, and they are not to be explained in the terms of rhetoric and composition. They depend on a particular insight into the world, a particular view of life, a predominating passion. We may not altogether like this passion, since it strikes at the roots of all complacency and satisfaction, but we cannot explain the style without it. Henry James provides a still more illuminating example. He developed a very complex and a very personal style, a style which has encountered a good deal of shallow depreciation. But once his mind was made up, the aim of Henry James was essentially the same as Newman's, to explain clearly and exactly his meaning, and not to bother about writing for writing's sake. Now, the meaning which Henry James was concerned to express was generally very complicated. It was concerned with life at its finest creative point, the point where moral judgments are formed. The deeper this penetrating mind delved into the psychological complexity of human motives, the more involved his world became. But it was obviously the real world, the only world worth describing, once your course is set that way. Henry James was ahead, fearlessly, irretrievably, into regions where few are found who care to follow him. He was driven by a force far more powerful than writing for writing's sake, by what he himself would have called a sacred rage, by which Coleridge called a predominating passion. End of conclusion, Chapter 15. End of English Prose Style by Herbert Reed.